My friends, welcome to our panel today, wherever and whenever and however you are in the world. My name is Rheinberger. I'm going to be your moderator, and our topic is working towards a more humanistic society of the future, challenges for the self within complex systems. And aren't we truly in a world of complex problems? Once we beat smallpox, but decades on, we're struggling to beat our latest pandemic in the face of widespread misinformation and mistrust. All the while, we're also struggling to deal with climate change, where again, the science is clear, but the solution is not. That's not to mention widespread poverty and suffering, which our economic system is struggling to overcome. No wonder ourselves are challenged. Well, we have an incredible lineup of panelists to talk this through, and we'll take some of your questions on the way through in the next hour or two. It's a panel of people who are equally scientific and spiritual, in touch with both the hard science and the ineffable mysteries of life. Dr. Len Fisher is a true polymath, a scientist, a broadcaster, and an in-demand speaker, able to wax lyrical about both the science of nanotechnology and the physics of dunking biscuits. Peter Hershock, hello Peter, is Director of the Asian Studies Development Program at the East-West Centre in Honolulu, Hawaii. Amongst other things, he's helped launch the Centre's initiative on humane artificial intelligence. The Venerable Juewei is head of the program for Humanistic Buddhism. Good morning to you, Venerable. She's director of the Humanistic Buddhism Centre and senior lecturer at the Tien Institute in Australia. And she was also a former computer scientist before taking her vows. And Stephen Hill is Emeritus Professor at the University of Wollongong and is a former director for UNESCO in Indonesia. His new book is the Kyoto Post-COVID Manifesto for Global Economics. Your questions are welcome, but with over 800 people attending around the world, please forgive us if we don't get to yours, as Grace and her team will comb through them and then we'll put some of them to the panel. Can I start with you, Peter Hershock? Humane artificial intelligence seems like an oxymoron in itself. How do we teach our artificial intelligence masters to be more humane?
That's a great question, and it really comes back to teaching ourselves how to be more humane. Although we talk about artificial intelligence, the systems that we're developing are really synthetic intelligences. You've got machine learning, deep learning, algorithmic systems, computational systems, and they're making use of human data that is the record of our own intelligent activity in the world. So that has our values and our intentions embedded within the choices that we're making online, how we're conducting ourselves, and everything that we're doing in social media. And so it's the blending of the record of our own intelligence with these machine systems that we're actually living under. And so do we want more humane, intelligent technology? Then we've got to be more humane human beings. And so the real question I think we need to be grappling with is, how do we go about doing that? What kinds of character, what kinds of energy do we need to be able to engage with these technologies in a way that the values that are infused into them are ones that are consistent with realizing more humane futures?
Are you seeing any evidence that that is being incorporated into any of the artificial or synthetic intelligences that are being developed around the world?
You know, there's a group at MIT that's actually trying to do some work in the way of developing algorithms that are sensitive to, say, acts of kindness, can identify when kind acts are being engaged and then to kind of reinforce those. So you can use these algorithms to reinforce any behavior you want. It could be commercial behavior, it could be the misinformation behavior that drives political divisiveness, or it could be using it as a feedback system to help human beings to be what we really ought to be, our better selves. But there's a kind of a dark edge to that particular way of looking at things. Because the systems, especially the commercial systems, are based on attracting and then exploiting our own human intention. And what we run the risk of is these systems of the new global attention economy getting so good at giving us what we like, what we want, what we desire, that we end up losing our own freedom of attention. And without freedom of attention, we will not have any freedom of intention. And without freedom of intention, we're not going to be able to do anything beneficial on behalf of our ourselves, our families, our communities, or the rest of the world. It's crucial we retain freedom of attention.
Peter, we've seen that in a nutritional sense. We know what humans want. We want sugar and we want salt and we want fat. And these things were normally, from an evolutionary sense, rare. You know, sugar bags from bees or ants that Aboriginal societies found were very rare, and you would gorge on them once a year. So to give us what we want is in some senses dangerous, isn't it? So what's the challenge there?
You know, I think that if you want to read it as a kind of let's do a dystopian science fiction future where these systems get better and better at giving us what we want. But I think eventually where we end up is a world where, you know, we have a biometric reader on our computer that does a body scan. So you'll never buy clothes that don't fit. They will only fit. You'll have access to your own personal AI advisor to give you sense about what to wear, what not to wear, what books your children ought to read, what books they shouldn't read, how to stay healthy, what to eat. And once we get into that kind of a world where we only get what we want, where we don't have to work through the really difficult stuff of changing who we are really fundamentally by making major mistakes. I've learned so much in my life by screwing up so big and just making a true mess out of a family situation, a work situation, and then having to backpedal and say, okay, how do I undo this? And what does it require out of me in terms of my attention, my commitment to get that to happen? So I think the worst case scenario is we live in a world where we're all in our little karmic cul-de-sacs, where we have a virtual world that only makes us happy. And it'll be like living in one of the heavens in the old Hindu cosmology or Buddhist cosmology, from which you cannot attain enlightenment. You have to be in this space where you make mistakes and you adjust. Sentient beings are numerous. We can't count them. And yet we have to somehow learn to respond virtuosically to each and every one. And that requires trial and error, improvisation. I just don't want to see us lose a world of improvisation.
Oh, here. Thank you, Peter. Len, were you wanting to leap in there? I thought you put your hand up, or that could have been just a reflex on your part.
Mainly to say hello to everybody. And it's a really great honor to have been invited here as a scientist, really from outside the Buddhist community. The things that we've been finding, the Buddhist values that I think are espoused by this community are very much the sorts of things that we've been finding in recent science. So one of the things I didn't put in my summary is I've been working for the last 2 years with the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, looking at, well, you mentioned quite a few of the global threats that we're now facing. AI, of course, is another one. We put the whole lot together to work out empirically, not from a religious standpoint, not from an ethical standpoint, but from a practical standpoint. What do we have to do in order to survive these, in order to govern them, in order to progress? And the major thing that we found was just what has been coming out of this meeting so far and will continue to come out: cooperation. Cooperation means care, compassion, care for others. If we don't have that, then we're missing one of the essential ingredients in being able to move forward. So that's from my science. And that's what's been buzzing around in my head for a little while.
Well, we can see why Len Fisher's on the panel. Venerable Juewei, can I turn to you? If more and more of our mental capacity is outsourced to artificial intelligence, does this give us the ability to be more human? What is a more humanistic society?
Thank you, Nick, for your thoughtful questions. I think the first question is about addressing us as an individual, what it means to be more human, and then as a collective, what is a humanistic society like? So let me begin by saying that I really consider myself quite lucky that I can live during the time of a pandemic, during the time of climate crisis, and the escalation of mental health problems. This is because I can be one of a larger group of people, for example, the 118 gathered on Zoom right now, looking for holistic and collective analysis of the causes. And then together, let's try and create co-create some solutions as we are doing right now. So let me start by using an example from last week. Facebook rebranded itself as Meta Platforms to signal a shift to focus on the development of something called a metaverse, and that's spelled METAVERSE. They use virtual reality and augmented reality so that people can now interact with one another using avatars, which means that if we look in the screen now, we may not be seeing the real face. So Microsoft then also announced that it will also launch Metaverse on Teams next year. And users will be able to choose an avatar to use during their meetings. So Nick, not only are we outsourcing our human capabilities to AI, but we will also be able to create whole new identities in our interaction with people in increasingly virtual worlds. So my concern at individual level is that we are outsourcing our human abilities and our identities to these metaverses. And these are the same ethical imperatives that Peter has raised. And like just what Peter has said, we have to, if we live in this ideal heavenly worlds, how are we going to get enlightened? Because my goal as a Buddhist, my practice, is to help me get awakened to the nature of reality or the way things really are. And we can't do that if technology takes me further and further away from this truth through avatars and make-believe worlds. And it will not give me enduring happiness, I think, because if I speak of happiness, I think of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' reference to 3 determinants of happiness. He says that for one to be happy, we have to 1, do good to others, 2, have a network of strong and supportive relationships, and 3, have a sense that one's life is worthwhile. So I think that links back to what Len has said about us coming together in cooperation. But as a former artificial intelligence programmer myself, I also know that my initial motive for designing expert systems was to give users more time to do meaningful things in nature and with other people. However, what I've noticed is that we seem to be more wrapped up with digital device use rather than time out in real life communities. So I'm not suggesting a revolution against technology. Just as Borg in Star Trek says, any resistance is futile. My motto is to go with the flow, but in wisdom and compassion. So can we co-create ways for the advanced technologies to help us as individuals flourish and not perish? So for the symposium, I thought of something that I'd like to introduce to everyone and hear your feedback. It's called a metaverse, METTA, and there's a long A, so meta universe, verse, VRSE. And I think that through a metaverse, we can become more humanistic, both individually and as a society. So meta means loving kindness. In 1939, an Anglo-American poet, W.H. Auden, says that we must love one another or die. Venerable Master Xing Yun reminds us that practitioners can give up anything except loving kindness and compassion. So metaverses can take place anywhere and with anyone, such as we can wish everybody safety and peace. And then this meta can also be sent through electrons on Zoom screens to everyone here in this Zoom universe. So just as Lou and Hugh wisely reminded us yesterday at the keynote dialogue, let us not forget the crisis. So let us use this crisis to cultivate kindness for ourselves, our neighbors, and our communities. And we can do so whether in virtual worlds or in real worlds that's based on virtue. So Nick, I believe that a more humanistic society is one filled with metaverses.
The metaverse and the virtuous world rather than the virtual world. Your puns are using their power for good, Juewei. Thank you very much. I do have some questions, which I will get to in just a moment, but I want to put one question at least to each of our panelists. Stephen Hill, for you, we've invented and evolved a system called economics, which prizes constant growth in a finite world. This is the subject of a couple of your books, including your latest. What would a more human economic system look like?
Nick, the first thing is economics has been around a fairly long time. I mean, like since the very first caveman exchanged a stone axe for two animals brought in by one of the other guys. What we've done from the 18th century onwards in particular is to build an economic system based on fundamentally self-interest and therefore profit to that self-interest and power, including, in fact, right from the very start, when the first steam engine was attached to a factory and changed the nature of work by a factor of 100 in terms of the pace of being able to do things. It's a system based on a set of very clear values. Now, what we've been talking about, what everybody's talking about now in the scientific realm, certainly in the keynote speakers yesterday, and in the general community, what's happening now is saying it's gone too far. The self-interest has got to a point where it really not only doesn't work, it's actually likely to wipe out the planet. I mean, it's really, really serious. So what we're talking about is a complete shift in the way we see things. What's been happening with this society is the economic sets the framework for the society. Now, what we're talking about is where humanity sets the framework for economics, okay? Now, a key thing about, I think, particularly somebody like Hugh Mackay has pointed out, and so do many others, is that everybody is responsible for what we then become as a new society from here on, everybody. In fact, I remember what at the time I thought, back in the 1960s, I did Australia's first MBA and PhD in business of all places. And there was a consultant around who we thought was a total joke because all he basically did was to go to a company and stick signs on the wall saying, think people. Okay, well, in fact, that's exactly what we need to do right now. Think people in everything we do. So, for example, the last 2 days before this conference, I was at one which was run by the Joint Academies of Australia, which is Humanities, Social Science, as well as the Royal Society. And what it was looking at our technological future. And the key thing that came out of that was to say that both in the training of people, for example, who are involved in technological development, as well as in general society, we should pay a lot of attention to building a nutritive environment for this ability for each individual to be able to make a difference. So, for example, they specifically said, if we're talking about IT development, there is no ethics built in that. I mean, you look at the ethics of Facebook, the ethics of TikTok, they make profit. They're not to help people. I mean, for example, Facebook specifically turns love into its opposite. It's into having lots and lots of friends by having ticks on your little Facebook box, not giving. It's turned everything upside down. And so what they were saying is a basic structure of developing a new society for the future goes right the way down to how we train, how we develop people. And they pointed out, we don't need to teach facts anymore. You can pick that up with Google in a second. What we need to teach is how to judge them. And that's in all education, but it's particularly in technological education for people coming out. Okay, then we look at the kind of structures or societies that we can evolve. Well, the key thing here is to think people. I mean, where humanity comes from is here, you and me and our being able to talk to each other. I mean, we're sort of a bit limited by a virtual world right now, but a real one. In other words, we build it into what we do in our communities, what we do in everyday life, in how a company is run. So to take a very key example, in Japan, there are still companies from a tradition called the Sanyo, the Sanyo Yoshi concept, the triple win concept. Now, there's no reason business can't do this. There's a normative structure of the business that says any decision's got three aspects to it. It's got to be good for us and the people who are here. It's got to be good for the client. And it also has to be good for the society around us. Now, what this has built is an atmosphere and a way of dealing with each other based on trust, not on contract. And the result of this is that the whole structure is related to building a relationship into the society. We can do this everywhere in the way we build our society structures of the future. So we can do it in business, we can do it in the community, we can do it in daily life, but coming back to something which particularly Hugh emphasized, everybody Everybody is involved in this. And there's a nice comment from Mahatma Gandhi who says, if you want to change the world, you've got to be that change yourself.
Reminds me of something my father used to have on his desk. He was a long-term Rotarian. I think they have a 4-way test. I mean, is it the truth? Is it fair? Is it good for all concerned? Or will it build friendships in the future? I'm pulling that out of my memory here, but it sounds very similar to the Japanese triple test.
It is. That is.
Yeah.
And it's just building a different normative structure. If I can just add one more thing to that, one of the very strong movements that's emerging right now is the circular economy movement about sustainability in business. And the whole point of that is that you look at industry differently. You look at your factory differently. You look at it as a whole process where waste is part of the process, not something you throw away at the end. So you build it in and you have total recycling back to the basis of everything that you're doing as a way of doing things. Now, this particular movement is spreading pretty fast right now through Europe. It's even touching Australia and New Zealand. But the idea of it, again, is care. It's care of the environment. It's looking again at what we have and turning it around. That's what we all do.
All right, Len Fisher, can I turn to you for one more question? You wrote a book called Weighing the Soul. Sadly, I don't think you found a definite mass for it. What would you say is the greatest human challenge for scientists such as yourself right now?
The greatest human challenge to scientists, of course, is to understand people and how they behave. And Weighing the Soul was my first effort at trying to explain to people how scientists think through something I thought would caught the attention. This was actually an American doctor who put dying patients on a scale, waited until they died, and saw if there was a change. There was a change in weight. It was about as much as a slice of bread. I'll pass the challenge along. There are possible explanations, including sudden cooling. But where that took me to was thinking, well, the thing that science most needs to communicate is any efforts that we can contribute to how people interact and understand each other. So I sat around waiting for the experts to write books and nobody did, so I did it. And the first one was on a thing called game theory, which is the tactics we use in interacting with each other, which all of these theorists, physicists for the most part, assume that we try to do the best for ourselves rather than from the other. And it don't work. So at the moment, actually, with the Future of Humanity Institute, we're developing a different sort of game theory, which what happens when people actually interact compassionately? Can we take it further? Can we get better results? How, this is the most important question of all, how can you reach the people who have beliefs that are different and attitudes to life that are different to yourself? And we're trying to work out just what can we say about that. We talked about complexity. I've written about complexity. I've written about the threats that we face. But everything that's hitting me, as far as science is concerned, is that the thing that we've made very little progress on. We've made such progress in understanding the physical world, the chemical world, the biological world. We've made no progress in understanding ourselves. It's got to come from somewhere else. And I believe it's got to come from groups like this, who have put serious efforts and serious thoughts into understanding interactions. I still think the thing that we're missing is how do we reach the people, and this is what I've been trying to do with my books, is trying to reach the people who wouldn't normally read those books. The people who are not that interested in popular science or not that interested in the questions, and say, look, this is the reason why you should be. Despite the fact that you think in such a different way, this is what you need to be thinking about. And in the present context, how do we reach those people? Do we reach them through their Buddha nature? Do we reach them through the overlay of beliefs that's hiding that nature? I don't know the answer, but I think it's the most serious question we have.
Would you say that in some aspects, evolution or the understanding of evolution and even economics is fundamentally flawed because we assume self-interest? But there is this overwhelming need to be kind in so many humans.
But you're absolutely right, Nick. It's that assumption of the pursuit of self-interest. We know that it's not actually true in a lot of cases. We know that that there are now economic theories coming out which take account of how people really behave and how people do care for each other and how people do cooperate. But these are still fairly fringe activities compared with most of what I think Stephen might agree with what most of goes on in economics still. And this is this pursuit of self-interest that we're trying to shake. I'm doing my best. Stephen's doing his best. Peter's doing his best. Juewei's certainly doing her best. And I really don't know. This is what I'm hoping to learn here, especially from the chat. There will be a lot of people out there listening who have ideas that I might not even have thought of, that we might not even have thought of. And maybe these can come through that will help with the next step. Because all I can do is, while I'm still here, is just keep pushing.
Thank you, Lynn. We have several questions coming through. Thank you very much for everyone that's participating. Daniel Wu has one, which I think is probably good for you, Peter and Juewei. Good morning, everyone, and auspicious greetings. How do we ensure the AI engines that influence real-life decision-making processes follow ethical values? Do you think stronger regulations are required in the tech sector to keep large corporations who control these engines in line? We'll start with you, Peter.
Well, certainly, I think that we do need ethical oversight. The problem is which ethics. And every ethical system, we've got lots of them. You know, as you start categorizing them, if you're a philosopher, as philosophers do, you've got your duty-based ethics and your virtue-based ethics and your consequentialist ethics, and maybe feminist ethics, environmental ethics. But every ethical system has a blind spot. If it didn't have a blind spot, it would be the one-all ethical system for everybody. And while every ethical system wants to be the universal system, none of them are really candidates. And so I think what we need to do is to start developing the kinds of conversation that will allow us to develop what I refer to as ethical ecologies. We take different ethical systems from around the world, African Ubuntu, Islamic ethics, Chinese ethics, Confucian, Buddhist ethics, which vary across the region, from Southeast Asia to East Asia and into the West. And you have contributions from people coming from very different ethical perspectives, with the idea that what we're looking for is ethical diversity, where diversity is not just a quantitative measure of how many different people are sitting at the table. Diversity is a relational achievement when the differences that are present are activated as the basis for mutual contribution to sustainably shared flourishing. So what we want to do is to develop the kinds of conversations internationally, interregionally, globally, with really different stakeholders, and to have those difficult discussions to start to come up with an idea of what kind of governance do we want globally, what's included within it. And it may well be that in some sectors like autonomous vehicles, maybe a utilitarian approach is all the best. That's maybe the best that we can do in terms of building ethics into those systems. But if we're talking about decision-making, if we're talking about recommendation engines, if we're talking about using AI for judicial decision-making and the criminal justice system, then we're talking about systems that have to be sensitive to history, to people's identities that are historical, not snapshots taken in the present. And so we need to start building in really different ethical sensibilities than the ones that are currently on the table in most of these AI ethics forums, where essentially what they're doing is say, pick the easy fruit, transparency, privacy, take a couple of universal values that everybody can agree on. But then if you start asking someone from Hangzhou, what does privacy mean? Ask somebody from Houston in the US, what does privacy mean? It means something entirely different. And those differences need to be taken into account.
More questions. Thank you, Peter. That was lovely. Juewei, there's one here which I think is right in your ballpark. May I please ask how are Buddhist practices going to align with the pursuit of economics and sciences, yet not get lost along the way?
Can you repeat where Buddhists?
Yeah, how are Buddhist practices going to align with the pursuit of economics and science and not get lost along the way? I mean, you are a former scientist, now a venerable. How have you squared these circles?
Yes, and actually that may relate to what I've been hearing, what Peter has said as well. As I listen to Peter talk about the diversity of ethical values, I go like, wow, as a former programmer, AI programmer, how am I going to program this into the system, this diversity? And then I go back to perhaps, what does it mean to program compassion? I think there's a whole new field around Bodhisattva AI that's developing. And I think it has to start with the programmer himself or herself, embracing the virtues of compassion, of diversity, of inclusivity. And so the same thing would apply, let's say, into the practice of economics. So for example, if I were practicing ethical values of, let's say, of generosity, I will be practicing the power of the gift instead of the power of the greed. So it will be economics based on the power of the gift that Stephen often tells us about, and the power of a caring community. So economics doesn't have to be for self-interest. I don't think that Adam Smith started on the principle of self-interest, but as it evolved, things changed. So now it's for all of us. All of us will have that power. We can empower ourselves to be more present. And this is the reason why we have communities of practice here at Nantian Institute, to develop the habit of a pause, a reflective pause, so that in our everyday life, we can cultivate that before we make any decision, whether it may be an economic decision, a social decision, we take a pause and reflect on what is that intention, or is it based on attention that has been robbed from me as a result of the devices and the technologies that I'm using. So once we manage to be more aware, I think we can make better decisions, whether economically or socially.
Stephen Hill, can I ask this one of you? This has come from Doreen Fang. How do we rebuild trust in such a divided world where we are seeing increasing fake news, polarizing opinion, and political dysfunction? Protests have become the norm to vent dissatisfaction and disagreement, and the COVID pandemic has accelerated mental illness and domestic violence. How do we turn around this psychic epidemic? What do you think may be the barriers in promoting the principles of humanistic Buddhism in crisis response, given it has a religion tag? A complex question for you, Stephen, but you're the best person to answer.
Oh, you're very kind. Look, people have talked about the power of the gift, and it is something which I really do believe and have practiced and found it actually works. If we're always thinking in terms of deals, we will not have trust. We will have trust when we're prepared to be offering to other people, when we're prepared to give basically, in the way we deal with things. And it always comes back in the way, for example, that Len talked about before, about the young person, Len, that you talked about in your talk. I think the key thing is to exercise in our own values, the values of being sharing and of giving, and not particularly looking for the reward. That will build trust in terms of all of our relationships. Now, the other side of this, I think we've got to pay very careful attention to, is what's happening to the people out there in the community, not just the technology people. There's a serious danger, a really serious danger of building what would be called technological serfdom. In other words, an underclass that is completely controlled by these values of lack of trust, values of lack of care, which really are involved in many of the technological ways that which intervene in our lives right now. And this means that I think that, it's a classic opposite case, in fact, in the government system here recently, or last year, when they decided that arts graduates were not really necessary, so they increased the price of the degree by twice. It just so happens all but 2 prime ministers have arts degrees in our history, in the recent history. In other words, it's taking away what everybody needs to be able to understand. They need to understand the sort of values we're talking about, and certainly the values of seeing how compassion works, how giving works, how understanding other people works. And that means building this understanding so that people don't, as they do now, look at an IT solution, for example, or a number of cases, as very classically is the case with Donald Trump in the United States, and they believe it without really ever investigating it. We don't judge. We don't know how to judge. And I think this particularly comes back to the change of values towards compassion and towards trust. It's seeing this world in a different way. And that goes right the way back to all education, which is building a nutritive environment for both trust as well as for equity.
It makes me think that something you mentioned in your first answer, that Facebook, for instance, the currency is about likes, how many likes I can gather. But it almost needs a 180-degree turn. You know, how many likes can I give?
Yes.
How many words of appreciation, giving rather than taking? We're kind of getting a bit of a common theme here. Len, where does ethics come into the education of young scientists? Where is it that they get taught to say, just because I can doesn't mean I should?
It's certainly it's coming in more than it used to, mainly because the young scientists themselves are offering the challenge. They're the ones who are saying, should we be doing this? The older ones quite often have been brought up on a tradition of, if we can, then we should, or indeed we must because somebody else will. But I think it's a matter of not so much training scientists in ethics, but training everybody to think. And incidentally, Adam Smith was mentioned. Did you know that beside his recommendation for the pursuit of self-interest, he also wrote an essay saying that this won't work except within an ethical framework of care and cooperation?
Really? So this was an addendum to it. Is only through the self-interest of the butcher. Okay.
This was Adam Smith himself. So he was pointing it out in the case of economics. I think we need to be bringing people up, not as Stephen was saying, to have arts and science as something separate. In fact, I made a point later in life of doing a bit of philosophy. So I've actually got both, which I can wave around if I want to impress people. But the point is, I think, to teach the whole, not to teach science as something separate, or to teach arts or ethics or understanding people as something separate, but to teach an interest in how the world works as a whole. Because that's what science is about, and that's what the arts are about. That's what writing's about, that's what painting's about, that's what music's about. There are different ways of trying to understand the world and trying to express our understanding of the world. We need to bring them all together, and we need to bring them all together early so that young people start thinking this way instead of being brought up as a scientist or a writer or an accountant, or worse still, someone who works for Facebook, I suppose.
a human.
No, I think we've got to pursue Venerable Juewei's idea. This is just
the metaverse. Meta
is just what I was talking about when I was talking about reaching out to those who are different to ourselves. Meta is the way of doing this. Meta is the way of breaking through that cover that so many people have, in your terms, overlaying their Buddha nature with self-interest, self-pursuit, selfishness. And either you can get in underneath that, burrow underneath to reach the Buddha nature, which I think a lot of people probably in this audience think is the way to go about it. I've been thinking of reaching over the top, of touching the bits that we really don't like and don't agree with, trying to find some common ground, and then burrowing through to the Buddha nature. But they're both on. But as I said, mainly in terms of your question, let's get back to bringing it all together as a way of understanding the world and our place in it, rather than having these separate views. And that's your best shot.
All right, thank you, Len. This next one, I'm going to do something crazy and throw it open to anyone that would like to put their hands up. And in fact, if all of you do, I'd be delighted. Gawain Powell Davies asks, how do we work with the differentials in power that currently advantage the interests of the few over the impact on the many? You're all too kind to start off with, but feel free. Peter, go for
I'll
it.
start with something relatively simple. I'm talking about, for example, big tech. And how do we get big tech to start swinging these massive boats around and setting a new course, a different course for technology? Big tech is probably not going to do it with regulation. They're not going to do it because of law. They stand above that. They influence law. They influence that decision making. They can deliver candidates for presidents, for premierships, and so on. So they're very powerful. But I think that they can be persuaded to do what most people want to do, and that is to be appreciated by others. But what they need to know is what it is that will get us, the general population, to respond with appreciation for what they're doing. So I've recommended to students when I do talks on AI, and they say at the end, what can we do? What can we do? And I say, well, there's 250 million college and university students around the world. If all of you banded together and engaged in a collective action and targeted each week a different major company that makes use of your data to train its algorithms, and you say, collectively, we will go on strike. We will go on a data strike for 1 week against your company, unless you decide that you're going to use 10% of your revenues to meet, say, the Millennium Development Goals of the UN, something concrete, and just throw the challenge out to them and keep doing it. It's collective action, and it's not digital fasting, like I can do that as an individual. It's a strike. It's collective action, it has demands, and if it's global, it will have an impact. But we need global action, global collective action.
It's very concrete, Peter. Thank you. Anyone else want to join us on that one?
Well, I would think that, okay. That Peter's shock tactic might well work. I think this is the biggest problem, brilliantly identified, as the biggest problem that we have in the world, is the conflict between the pursuit of understanding, which occupies a minority of us, and the pursuit of power and profit. And if you look back over history, power and profit have trumped the pursuit of understanding repeatedly, which is why you have your history in terms of wars, in terms of takeovers and so on. Whereas the pursuit of understanding is actually the thing that has taken us right through this stage, as it were, almost underneath the covers. So how do we overcome that? I think hopefully through a very slow, gradual process, aligned with what I was saying earlier, of getting at the children and getting them to understand the value and the beauty and to appreciate what pursuing understanding actually gives you. It doesn't have to be major. They don't all have to be scientists or writers or philosophers. But if they value it, and we get that audience big enough, then we may well reach a critical mass of the population that really value understanding. There are some cultures where it's highly, even in Scotland, for example, it's much more valued than in other places. It can be done. Just building up that sense of values, I think, is terribly important. And this goes with building up the values of compassion and care. It all goes together. Understanding means understanding other people. It means feeling for them, as well as understanding the world and the trees and all the rest of it. It all goes together. Understanding is the basis. And that's going to lead to care and compassion. And we have to start young.
Can I just make a brief comment there? I mean, one of the things particularly that Hugh Mackay talks about and talked about yesterday is the importance of just living the way that we wish the world to be. He talks about that as Australia. He said, if you want Australia to be different, live that way. But then also tell your politicians that that's what you want them to do too, to reinforce this way of doing things. And I think this is the ultimate control over politics, is simply to say, we're not going to vote for you unless you follow the path which we really believe really matters. And people get together in the same way that I think Peter's talking about, as a global or as a national movement, ultimately, because they're saying the world needs to be different. If you don't do that for us, we're not going to vote you into power anymore.
Juewei.
When I listen to this question, I recall what my teacher, Venerable Master Xing Yun, has done with Fo Guangshan. I think we have to start with first the faith. We have to believe that it can be done. It can be done through ourselves and through the community. And with that faith, I think it's the compassion not to leave anyone behind, whether old or young, anybody in any country around the world. And then a bit at a time, investing in education like he has in the 5 institutions of higher education around the world, and all the way from kindergartens, all the way down to kindergartens. Everyone can benefit from education. And all these institutions, we base ourselves on the social sciences and the humanities, as opposed to the trendy technological business type of classes. And focusing back again and again on what it means to be human, and that vision to create for ourselves a better and better society. I think it's with all of us, and all of us being a little cogwheel and all turning in that direction will eventually make it and touch the hearts of those in power. And if not now, then the future generations will make their way there in time.
We have a question here, which I think has just been answered, but I do want to read it because I think Nicole's very intelligently put it, wondering what role does individual and collective accountability have in developing a more humanistic society? And this is exactly what Peter's talking about. And you, Stephen, and Hugh McKay, you be the change you want to see.
Yep.
And collectively we have that power. So we'll move on just to something for you. I'll stay with you, Juewei, just to this one, that the 2 main issues that I mentioned in my introduction, the pandemic and the climate change issue, seem to come down to a battle of the self, the rights of an individual or the rights of an individual country versus the greater good of society and community. So how does Humanistic Buddhism try to solve that dilemma?
The rights of the individual. I think if we operate from a position of abundance instead of lack, that will help. As I've stated in my presentation, the minute we operate from a position of lack, we go into this appropriational circuit of wanting more and more. But if we really want to exercise the power of the gift and build this humanistic virtuous society, we'll have to operate from a position of abundance. We have an abundance of compassion, of metta to give. If we can't give money, at least we can give a smile. We can give encouragement and hope. And you know what is a big gift? Forgiveness. Forgiveness is a big gift, whether to be forgiven or to forgive others. And that requires us to empower ourselves. Venerable Master Xing Yuan teaches us to always say, you are right and I am wrong. Initially I go, how could that be? I'm always right, aren't I? And then I realized the power of that statement of saying, you are right and I am wrong, because it empowers me. Instead of me asserting my right to be right, I'm offering you the gift and offering the understanding that everyone has been talking about.
Peter, I could see you nodding eagerly. There's probably nowhere in the world that debates the individual's right versus the collective right than it does in the USA. What's your perspective?
Well, I think that one of the things that Buddhism offers us is a way to start rethinking some of the very basic principles of our political organization, like this notion of human rights. So to me, human rights are a travesty. They are and it's an embarrassment for humanity that we need human rights. We shouldn't need to organize principles of human rights. That's a shame on humanity, that we are so bad animals that unless we have those restrictions, we drive people down into positions of utter indignity. Okay? So human rights are not something to be proud of. We should be ashamed that we need them. But human rights, it's like battlefield triage. There's a wound, you have to do something to staunch the bleeding. Human rights staunch the bleeding, but every right comes with obligations. And I think that what we've not understood is that obligations are gifts to others. And if you think through what the karma of offering is, the karma of offering is you make some little tiny gift. Maybe it's the smile that Juewei mentioned. Maybe it's a small donation to a charity or something. It's something very small, but the karma of offering is it's cyclic, spiral. So in order to be able to get better at offering, you have to be given the opportunity to offer again. But to have the opportunity to offer and to kind of get that spiral going, you have to have something to offer. So for me, poverty is the lack of something to offer that others would value. What's the karma of wanting? The karma of wanting is to get better at getting what I want. I have to get better at wanting. That is, I have to get better at feeling like I lack something, that I need something, that I don't have something. So to get better at getting what you want, you have to get better at wanting. And to get better at wanting, you can't ever really want what you get. That's the spiral. And so which one do we want? Do we want to play the finite game of power and trying to get what we want? Or do we want to change the dynamics and move to an infinite game, a politics of strength, where strength is not getting things to work out the way we want. Strength is what it takes to engage everybody who's involved in this game, the economic game, the political game, a sport game, whatever game it may be. Marriage is a game, but play it as an infinite game. What you're doing is you're trying to improve the quality of play, the quality with which everybody's included in that, distinctively offering something from their unique perspective. That's where I think we need to be moving, developing that karma of offering, moving from finite games to infinite games, giving up on power, and instead instituting a culture of strength.
Thank you, Peter. Stephen Hill, a lot of this relates to the fact that we are all trapped, for want of a better word, unless you're in North Korea, in a system called economics. And I recall reading Sapiens by Harari some time ago. He talked about that as a story that we all agree on. It's not really real. Money is the same. It's a story. The company, a limited corporation, is a story that we all agree on. It's not actually real, not like this glass is real. It's just a story that we agree on. Is there any chance that we're able to change that story to a different one, to improve the world, to make it more humane?
I think there certainly is. Do you mind if I come in a second by a different route, though? And it's from coming up from what Juewei was talking about before, and certainly about the nature of the society we're seeking to achieve, where the society controls the economy rather than the other way around. And the key thing is something which I think was probably the main conclusion of panel 1 yesterday. And that was basically that an inclusive society is one which is universal, but also completely likely to be different. Everybody's different within it, and we tolerate that. And I think one of the core things at a social level that really matters is listening to other people, seriously listening. And I'd suggest that there are 2 ways we listen. The first way is the most common one, which is listening to intervene, like just waiting, for God's sake, till they stop so you can get your point in there, because it really matters, much more important than theirs, rather than literally sitting back and just letting them go and finding ways to support where they're going and recognizing that difference. There's some really interesting things going on in music right now, looking at ways in which totally different forms of music can be brought together in the one overall symphony, which is polyphony. Very different things combining into an ultimately a single symphony that works. And I think it's the same thing in developing a new economy, is finding all the differences and finding a way in which, by listening, by drawing them together, by accepting difference, in our cultural form, at least, that we can bring together a way of dealing with each other where our humanity is what matters in the way we deal with things, and that's our judgment measuring stick, not economic advantage for either myself or somebody else. I think we can do it. I really think we can do that.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, panelists, and everyone else who has dialed in. So we might just throw open to each member of the panel to answer this one in about a minute or so. A wise friend of mine once told me to always look for the opportunity in a disaster. Juewei, you've said that this extended pandemic, for instance, offers humanity an opportunity to reflect on what we've been invited to learn. So whether it is climate change, bushfires, or the pandemic, what have we learnt in the last year that we should be applying in the future? Let me start with you, Venerable Juewei.
Metaverse.
And the virtuous world.
Definitely. That if we don't use this pandemic and this opportunity to learn that, if not now, then when?
Right, Peter Hershock, can we go to you? What do you think are the lessons we should be applying right now?
Well, I think one of them is as education and the workplace pivoted from real interactions embodied to virtual interactions, certainly good for convenience. That's been good for some families with small children. You could work from home and you don't have to split your time. But it's made really, I think, painfully apparent that a digital connection only doesn't do the same thing that an embodied first-person connection where you look into somebody's eyes and you can actually get brain-to-brain synchronization going. That is missing, and I think we don't want to give that up. I think we want to really conscientiously and carefully move back to in-person, connecting together, smelling one another, touching one another, feeding one another. And I think that is a big step in dealing with a lot of the divisiveness that we're now dealing with. Let's share a meal together.
I must say, Peter, your avatar of this distinguished silver fox is very, very good and almost looks human. Fantastic. And Stephen Hill, what about for you? What do you think are the lessons that humanity should have learnt by now? That
one of the key things I think that we probably all saw, even with lockdown, where people actually sacrificed their ability to talk to other people or see them simply so that we didn't spread the COVID epidemic. In community, you found people starting to genuinely talk to each other, to try and share with each other. You always see this with bushfires in small communities in the bush. People actually come together. That's what we have come out with from COVID. And that's what we have to stay with, because that's going to be, if anything else, one of the most important features of how we're going to handle climate change. It's people acting together, not acting for their own self-interest or separately.
Do we have to wait to the younger generation, such as my 28-year-old daughter, runs for Parliament for any kind of change to occur, seeing as Glasgow is...
I don't think we need to wait.
It's a little dispiriting.
Look at Greta Thunberg as a start. You don't have to wait.
Well, yeah, she's already there, but unfortunately, she's not on the podium at Glasgow. But we'll leave that for another time. Len Fisher, as I mentioned right in the beginning, we beat smallpox. We know how to do these things in the world. Why haven't we?
And you've just given my answer for me.
Apologies.
The real positive things that we've learned is just how well science can work as a cooperative enterprise when everybody just gets in and digs in. The sad thing that we've learned is that people outside science do not trust that enterprise.
Yes.
There's a sufficient number of them to disrupt it. So the real thing that's going on at the moment, which I think will come out extremely positively, is it's been a huge shake-up call to the whole scientific community. Well, they don't trust us. We have to learn how they can trust us. We have to become part of the community as well as the community becoming part of us. And I think that movement to make science more an integral part of our community and to make the community more an integral part of science is the most positive and helpful thing that has come out and will continue to come out.
All right, I'd like to thank all of our panelists as we come to the end of this wonderfully stimulating discussion. I couldn't think of anything better to do on my birthday. I'm going to have a wonderful day from here on in.
Absolutely.
Sue Hussain has really summed it up on the chat. She says, thank you everyone for the inspiring and encouraging sharing of thoughtful thoughts. Really thankful for the chance to be part of the symposium, and thank you to Venerable Juewei for answering my question earlier with Meptar, says Sue. And PC Chan says, thank you very much to all panel members for sharing your wisdom and insights as part of the Foundation for a Different and More Compassionate World. That brings us to the end of our panel. I thank you very much, Professor Stephen Hill, Dr. Len Fisher, Peter Hershock, and the Venerable Juewei. Have a wonderful day, and metta, and I shall also go to Star Trek, and I shall say live long and prosper. Goodbye.
Thank you.